Welcome to Between Product and Partnerships, a podcast focused on bringing together product, partnership, and engineering leaders to discuss how to build, support, and scale SaaS ecosystems. Presented by the SaaS Ecosystem Alliance and sponsored by Pandium, an integration platform and marketplace for ecosystems.
I'm Kelly Sarabin. I'm the Director of Marketing at Pandium, and I'm the co-founder of the SaaS Ecosystem Alliance. Today, we are going to be talking with Steve, who's the CEO of Stoplight. And we're going to be talking about APIs, API design, and API documentation. Steve, could you share a little bit about your background, and for people who don't know what Stoplight is, what it does, and why you're so passionate about it?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. My name is Steve Rodda. A little bit about my background. I'm a natural born coder. I've been coding since I was 8 years old. And for the past 20, 25 years, something like that, I'm getting old. I've had various roles in engineering type roles, product management roles, leading large engineering organizations. Some of their companies were SolarWinds, Logic Now, and then Sharewell before I got here at Stoplight. And Stoplight, quite simply, is just trying to change the way that people develop APIs. You know, we believe in taking a design first approach, and APIs are so critical and so important these days that you should actually think about them up front and put them at the very beginning of your development process. So that's a little bit about us.
Awesome. So yeah, I think for like younger people in the audience, or even people who are just new to tech, they're probably used to hearing about APIs in the last couple of years everywhere. But what do you think it means to be an API first company? And are all B2B SaaS companies API or should be API first? Like
Yeah.
It's different from an API as a product, right? Like what does that mean?
Well, it's like Mark Andreessen famously said, right? Software is eating the world. Like, the thing I like to add to that is, if software is eating the world, then APIs are the teeth. So whether you think you're an API company these days or not is kind of irrelevant. You're working with them. Your developers are working with them constantly. So an API first company, literally came from the term that we should develop our API first. And what I mean by that is, way back in the day, you used to actually like build your UI and your backend code and all that type of stuff, intermingle it together, and then release it. And that became problematic for all kinds of reasons, mostly maintenance and just ease of development type of speed. And so somebody along the way was like, hey, wait a minute, especially when web development came out, like, wait a minute, we should probably build these APIs before we build the UIs and separate these things out. The software development term for that separation of concerns. And so when that happened, that really kind of kicked off this API craze that happens today. And it started from just separating your UI and your back-end code. And now with mobile devices, omni-channel type of support, microservices, those types of deals, it's taken on a much larger meaning. So API first today kind of means that it's a higher order function. It's something you should pay attention to before you start developing, and you should also start thinking about the end users and how the data is going to be used, those types of things. I really think that API first is a precursor to what we call design first at Stoplight.
Yeah, and I'd love to unpack that a little more, because it's something you do hear in sort of dialogues on the internet. People are talking about, design first versus code first, and sort of, what do those two terms mean, and how should organizations be thinking about that? Are there advantages to code first? Is that something where in certain circumstances it might make sense?
Yeah, so gosh, I feel like the sage old developer now. Like, I was just this the other day, I was a young kid learning all these new technologies, but like, so it's it's an evolution. And actually, prior to code first or API first, any of those things, there's actually database first. And so all things kind of come full circle. I'm sure we'll talk about GraphQL later, but there used to be this concept that you should design your database first, and then everything else extended from that, right? And so each one of these is more of an evolution and an iteration on our overall thinking about how software should integrate together, right? So it was database first, then it was code first, and it's API first, and then we think design first is kind of the way that you go about doing that. So I just talked about API first a little bit there, but code first is kind of that second step there. And code first literally just kind of meant, we should think about developing the code, the object models, the relationship models, or those types of things, like before we go out there and think about the UI UX or go along those sorts of lines. So that I think is the pre-stage one, if you will, to thinking about your APIs first, and then the design first part is where I think we're really at these days. And what that design first to me means is that you start thinking of your API as a product, even if it's not. I mean, somebody's using it, right? Somebody is an end user of it. Somebody has to have that customer experience for it. And so, you'd sit down and spend tons of time designing your UI UX. You should spend an equal to amount of time designing the developer experience for that. And that's really where you're starting to think about these things in terms of consistency of use. Usability, like, is one variable called this over here, but it's called something different over there. Sitting down and actually putting on your product management hat and thinking about, just the overall experience that people will have with your APIs is the next iteration of the design first era.
And do you have advice for organizations? Over here in the partnerships world, we're really focused on external APIs, so being interoperable with other SaaS products. And, can there be conflicts in terms of, like, you have the product team, they want the product to do certain things for their users, they're kind of laser focused on that. And then the partner developer experience, who probably wants to see similar data models to others in your product categories. They're familiar. It's faster for them to build more integrations. Can there be a conflict between sort of the data models of the core product and what you might put in the API for the developer? And if there's a conflict between, like, the partner developer experience and the end user of your product experience, is there a way to think about sort of reconciling those and making choices there?
Yeah. So I think that, first of all, I've built many APIs that I thought were going to be used for this use case, and then were used in dozens of different ones. So I actually think it's not like an either or. It's not like build it for external or build it for internal. It's build it with what service you're trying to provide in mind, like what data can be consumed, and like if you're a sandwiches company, your end service is the sandwich, so it's like, so that's the kind of focus you're doing. How do I get those sandwiches to people, in what order, and that type of thing? How do I scale that sort of business? And so if you step back and go, well, is this an external API or an internal API, and you just develop it towards what services you're trying to provide, then who or where that person is that's using it doesn't particularly matter. And I would say, you should always start with the most external kind of view on it, because that's going to end up with the best product, right? So if you think customers will be interfacing it with directly, you're going to build it with ease of use in mind. And while that might translate to customer experience, if it is an external user, internally that just translates to efficiency and speed of development and those types of things that still kind of matter. And then you start talking about security, right? Like, how many people build internal APIs only and are like, oh, we don't have to secure this thing because it's just internal, right? And then somebody uses it for external uses, and then you're in a big trouble. So I always say start with the most external use case you possibly can, design and develop to that, and then your end product will be ready for any of the internal use cases that are kind of there. But think services first is how I would go about doing it.
And what would you say is sort of best practice along the process and tooling, potentially like Stoplight, in terms of that design phase of the API? Like, what are the internal and potentially external stakeholders that should be involved in that? And is there tooling that people should be using to sort of ensure it moves in like a sensible, reasonable way?
Yeah, so the enemy of all design is time, right? Like, and it's one of those deals where, the longer you let it sit on the shelf, the it either becomes useless, or in at best case it becomes useless. At worst case, it becomes misleading, right? And actually can misguide your customers, your end users, which is not great. So any tooling that you can have, or any best practices you can have that cut down on the time or the shelf life that your design or your architecture guidelines or those types of things, is beneficial. So obviously I'm a big fan of Stoplight, but really, you got to go to where the developers are at in most of those cases. So if you're working on a Git workflow, agile kind of sprint basis, anything that kind of gets that design in the front of those developers, on a day-to-day basis, is a big deal, and keeps those things fresh and keeps your design fresh, so that ultimately at the end of the day you have a better developer experience out of it.
And in terms of security, are there, I think you do see more and more companies for their external APIs using OAuth 2, although for customers, that's not necessarily always the case yet. But do you have sort of a list of best practices for security, or things that you're noticing that people aren't in the field, aren't really thinking of or implementing as much as they should?
Yeah, and straight up in terms of security, not don't do it yourself. That's that's my number one thing. Like, so there's like probably loads of, and I know I'm probably making all kinds of people mad when they say that, but the risk is just too great these days to think that you can outsmart somebody or write some custom code to do those kinds of deals. Stuff like Okta and other products like that are out there that can help take that authentication off. Those people put millions of dollars and time and hours into perfecting that type of stuff. So your home baked user authentication flow might be okay today, but next week there could be a flaw in it, and you've already moved on. So I would say, first and foremost, from a security perspective, don't do it yourself. I mean, third party sign in, all that type of stuff, OAuth 2, like you're mentioning, those types of things are too easy to integrate with today to much larger companies who could do security better than you can. Odds are, and so that's what I would say is leave it to a third party in that sort of sense, from a security perspective. In terms of just other standards and protocols that are emerging regarding APIs, there's obviously like async API, GraphQL, event-driven type of architecture that people are building these days. And you might sit here. I mean, Stoplight itself is based around the Open API specification, so RESTful APIs and those types of deals. But you might sit here and think I'm just a REST person, and that's not entirely true. You wouldn't kind of build the toolbox and just throw a hammer in there and go, hope for the best, if you're going out to build a big project. So use the best tool for the job. And in most cases these days, that's going to be multiple tools, like all of those that I mentioned: async API, Open, GraphQL, Open API, those types of deals. They're all on the rise. Like, if you go look at the adoption across all of those platforms, there's not one of them that's actually going down. So it's really isn't an either or scenario, or like one is being replaced by the other one. You have to think about those use cases across the board and across all of your services, and then use the best tool for the job to put those things out there. So it's a tough thing to grasp, that you might have all of those in your environment, but that's probably where we're headed.
Yeah, I'm actually doing a really large study of SaaS's external APIs, and when I looked at the top 100, meaning the 50 largest public and 50 largest private SaaS companies, most of them had a variety, and obviously some of them have like SOAP ones, things that are maybe a little bit older but just still existing because people were using them in the enterprise space and continue to use them. But you definitely saw a lot of GraphQL. Almost everyone has REST. Like, it's definitely but even down to when I looked at 100 Series D companies, that was mostly REST. It wasn't as much GraphQL as I was expecting, and I think Based on the early data of the study, it definitely seems like that's where companies are starting for their external API. And then as they grow, trying to offer more flexibility, give developers more options. Do you have any sort of high level thoughts on, when GraphQL, like what type of use cases that would be a good choice for?
Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't get much more flexible than allowing people to run queries against your database, right? So it's like that flexibility for a database or model or whatever it's hooked up to in the back end, right? But it's like that flexibility is one of those things. So if you have kind of a power user use case where you want to be able to mold the data and shape the data and get it back in any sort of fashion, like that's what GraphQL is really really good at and really excels at. So some use cases like that might be if you're even just building an application and this object or this set of data is going to be used in multiple places, but it's going to be used in different ways. That front end to back end kind of thing works really well with GraphQL. And matter of fact, Stoplight uses GraphQL for that exact purpose. So it's one of those things that if flexibility is key, then GraphQL is good. If more I don't know what the right term is, but more more formula or like order. Yeah, if your life craves order in it, there's nothing beats RESTful API, and it's also extremely easy to kind of wrap your head around conceptually the syntactical nature of RESTful APIs, because they often model your objects on the back end and the way that those users would be consuming them. So kind of conceptually, the flow through a RESTful API makes, in my opinion, a lot easier to maintain and to grasp and to integrate with and all of those things, which is why REST isn't going away anytime soon. In my opinion. So of course these things, could start a fight on Reddit, like no problem, right? So it's like, but that's kind of my take on it. So
Yeah, and I think once you have a large number of people using a certain standard or style, then there's sort of a momentum there, because from the company perspective, it's easier to get developers to work with it because they're already familiar with it, versus saying, hey, you've got to learn this whole new standard, especially in our use case when you're talking about partners, right? Because they're not working for you full time. So they don't want to, unless you're a strategic partner, they don't want to invest in a whole new learning style just for your integration. So, especially since you guys have this, pretty large customer base to sort of see what people are doing, when you look at sort of the last 2 to 3 years, what are sort of trends you're seeing in how companies are sort of, designing and documenting their APIs? Because you do still hear developers sort of voicing frustration around a lot of other companies' documentation, and particularly it's not up to date. Do you see that improving in market? Are people really getting better at that? Where's that going right now?
well, so I see it improving for sure, but the problem is like a race condition, a time condition, I think, more than anything else, right? So like if you go back to kind of what I was talking to before, you used to just build your back end, your front end, right? That was one case of this, right? And then we added multiple devices. So you're talking about iPads, all this other stuff, mobile devices, those types of things that need to integrate with it, right? And then we did microservices, right? So all of a sudden now all of your different services have to talk amongst each other via APIs, right? And then you're doing infrastructure as code and Kubernetes and containers and all these other things, right? So the amount of APIs that you have just exploded. And I feel like we're just at the beginning of that explosion. So people are just now starting to feel the pain of like, oh my gosh, we have not thought about all of these different possible interactions, or exposing them, or securing them, or developing to them, or maintaining them, or doing the updates and those kinds of things that are happening. So it's like the shockwave is just now hitting people in terms of how big of a bear all of those changes have become, and for them to manage. And so I think the biggest change that I've seen is just kind of like that storming phase that's going on right now, where people are like, whoa, we need to like rethink our approach to all of these different vectors and APIs and things like that we have in our system, whether that's partners or products, right? And so that's the biggest change I think that's there. And I think with that comes, okay, maintaining all of these and integrating with all of these is inefficient and causing problems for our organization. So what's the solution to that? And I really think the developer experience and focusing on your developer experience, like you focus on your user experience, is a good kind of tangible thing to attack and to address. And so product managers, folks like that, need to get more involved in the development and the maintenance of APIs. You could do the first couple of iterations by quickly and rapidly developing and designing an API, release the documentation in a mock server to some potential customers, whether that's internal or external customers, and kind of say, like, does this work for your needs, and will this fit what you need? Same thing with maintenance changes and those types of deals. You can mock them up really fast today, release the documentation, let a few customers do some iterations on that, get a lot of really good feedback that you couldn't before. So putting that planning up front, putting it onto the product managers, and really thinking about the developer experience, that's the biggest change, and will frankly help with the rest of the explosion that's coming down the road.
Yeah, and do you when it comes to the developer experience, do you have thoughts on SDKs? Because I was interested to see in this study that while most of the top 100 companies had SDKs in a number of different languages, even down to the Series D companies, most of them actually didn't, which was surprising to me. And I've seen one tool, I can't remember the name of it, that said, you can put in your open API specification and it will whip out all these SDKs for you. But I'm thinking either the Series D companies don't know about that tool, or it doesn't work as well as it the marketing implies, in the sense of, like, it must require someone to actually go in and either edit it or build upon it and support it in a way that's not programmatic. So I don't know if you have thoughts. Is that going to become more programmatic? Is this something developers really get a lot of use out of, or are they so familiar with REST that it's depending on the complexity, maybe it's not a huge time saver? What's your thoughts there?
I think everything's cyclical, and it probably was 5 years ago. SDK was like a dirty word, like UML or like entity relationship diagrams or sequence diagrams. These things have kind of gone by the wayside because we've, put speed of development and agile and feature development kind of ahead of the design process and the thoughtfulness of the whole thing. And so I think they're coming back. I think especially from what I just talked about, right? If you have async API, you got open RESTful APIs in there, you got GraphQL, and you're kind of doing this multiple approach for how you can access these data, some sort of SDK, and way for to make it easier on those developers to integrate their platforms or consume your data in that sort of sense is going to be required, down the road. So I think they're coming back and in a big way, to answer your question.
And in terms of organizations really investing in developer experience, are there ways you recommend that organizations kind of collect both qualitative and quantitative feedback on ways that they can sort of improve that experience over time?
Yeah, so I mean, it comes down to old school product management for me, and really the difference is, like, we haven't thought about APIs that way in the past, right? Like they've been a byproduct of whatever story or whatever feature you're kind of developing. So a developer needs a user's endpoint, to satisfy some story that got written, they write this user's endpoint regardless of, like, how that there might already be another user's endpoint that you could have used. There might be your first name or whatever the case field might be named F name versus first name spelled out, where it's as not all across your organization it's F name, or whatever the case might be. Without kind of style guides and thinking about your APIs in higher order, then that's where your developer experience kind of goes wrong. And that's what I mean. 95% of all APIs are developed that way. The only exceptions are probably companies like Twilio, SendGrid, like Stripe, people who started with like the API is our product. Those are probably the only exceptions, right? So like that to me is the key to adding product management in there, making it easy, because no product manager these days is going to be able to write open API spec by hand, for example. So low code, no code kind of tools that allow them to build out an API without that technical knowledge, and then potentially do mocking against that, send those mock servers, send that documentation to customers, and get that feedback before you ever handed it off to developers, I think is kind of the best practice these days. So find a tool that's accessible, that allows your product managers to get involved in the process, and manage it like they would any other feature or UI UX, and that's the key to good developer experience, I think.
And would you say that sort of is also the best way that organizations can ensure they're sort of maintaining and supporting the API design and also documentation over time? Because I think a lot of organizations do invest in that initial build, and they may even have great docs. They put a lot of work into the initial design of the API, but then it just kind of can become neglected in a lot of cases. And so, maybe the documentation goes out of date, but the API itself may go out of date, and the product evolves in other areas, and this is not caught up. I mean, do you think sort of the key to that is having ownership, having someone who in the organization, a product manager who just like is responsible for that? Or is there, other processes that should be put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. If it's not baked into your workflow, your developer workflow, it's going to get stale within 2 releases, right? So your documentation and your specification, those kinds of things just go out the window. Like, you might as well not have done them if you're not going to integrate them into your workflow process. And it also is where things like GraphQL become a little tricky, because with something so fluid, that you're constantly changing on the back end and those types of deals, the documentation can be very hard to keep up with just how fluid something like GraphQL is. So it's so build it into your workflow is number one. The second thing is build it into your CI/CD pipeline. So there's a tool out there called Spectral. It's an open source tool. Stoplight heavily contributes to it. And it allows you to build style guides for your open API specification, right? So, and then linting on top of all of that stuff, so that when your developers are building their APIs out there, it's always keeping it in check with your style guides across the board. So this allows you to kind of like, create the style guides first as those higher order type of design steps that I was talking about before. And then really hooks it into your continuous integration, continuous deployment platform, and allows the specification to become front and center when you're trying to develop and release code. So tools like that, force you to keep good design and force you to keep good documentation up to date. Because if it's screaming at your developers all day long, I guarantee you're going to pay attention to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And have you seen as part of that process, any organization sort of enabling, especially third-party developers to sort of put forth feedback? I mean, I think a lot of partner developer teams have emails you can reach out to, but
Sure.
Have you seen better ways where, a developer who is potentially working with the API and is having an issue can sort of voice or register the feedback?
So we use, man, I'm gonna butcher the name, but I think it's it's like product board. I think it is. I can't remember what the name of the tool is, but and we encourage our users to submit feedback to that, and just like they would any other feature, right? And so that's part of being a design first company in my mind, is that you're going to take your developer experience feedback as serious as your user experience feedback, or somebody who's using it on a mobile device or whatever the case might be, and build those into the process to fix, just like you would anything else, right? So that's the big thing I would say. There's a million of them that are out there. A lot of lot of people use Jira and things like that for keeping track of those tools and requests that kind of come in. But any of those things, like the important thing I think is that you take those as seriously. And it might sound like common sense, but trust me, being in the software industry for 20 years, if I got a customer who was angry about the user interface versus somebody who wants me to build the API differently, for like 18 of those 20 years, I would have ignored the API one. And I think that's a big part of what's changing, is that those need to be put front and center and on equal footing, and that'll help you overall build a better developer experience and have a better product. So
Yeah, so I wonder if you have any experience with sort of enabling potentially prospects or customers to sort of get buy-in internally. So, I think in an ideal world, executive leadership, everybody's on board with the value of developer experience and investing it. But of course, the reality is sometimes you might own something in an organization, whether you are a solo developer relations person or you're just an engineer or a product manager who's been put in charge of this, and you see the value and you know how important it is. But whoever you're reporting to doesn't. Is there anything you sort of could arm that person with in terms of how to approach executives and say, look, here's why this is something that we really need to invest in?
yeah, well, I mean, if you have a developer relations team, then you're halfway there. So that's a really good start, because you're already saying that the relationship that you have with those developers is important and worth investing in. So that's a good start. So and if you don't have one of those, I would be pitching for at least some sort of investment and stepping back and looking at those things. And so two other executives, I mean, I hate to sound trite, but it's like you got to put it in terms of dollars, right? And look, I'm a developer CEO and swore I would never care about those things when I got here. And guess what the first thing is I care about, right? So it's like, that to me, you have to look at those things about what's the return on investment and what are you going to get out of it, right? So if you invest in the developer experience, you get, if it's an external API or external facing kind of product type of thing, you literally just get customer service bonus points, right? Like you get your NPS scores go up. Developers can be strong advocates in a company. So if there's a product that has a great developer experience and you're evaluating it to buy it for your company, and there's another one that doesn't have it, like they're going to be picking the one that has the better experience for them when they go through that evaluation process. So all that's to be said, if you focus on that, you're going to win more deals, right? You're going to get more customer support. You're going to get, more customer success kind of results out of that, and happier customers equals more dollars down the road, right? So it's as important as your UI UX. That's the parallel I would draw, these days. Is it's becoming as important as your user experience. And most executives these days understand the importance of having good user experience. And so that's the parallel I would draw. If it's internal, I mean, it's still important and as important, and it's actually easier to explain in that sense that it just comes with efficiency. Like if you have a consistent style guide or common way that you're developing your APIs, then developers know that style guide by the back of their hand, and internally can just integrate with things much faster. And it speeds things up across the board. And if you use a tool like I was talking about prior to that and getting the product managements involved, the cost saving is immense, because you're building your design up front, and you take an iteration or two on it with internal customers or external customers, and that's saving valuable developer time. Like what would have used to happen is you go to build a bunch of features, and the developers kind of build what they need for the API out of necessity for whatever the story is or whatever the epic is, right? And then they would go to release it, and the infrastructure people would be like, we can't do this. What are you talking about? Like, this is crazy. Like, go back to the drawing board. And so the developers go, oh, okay. And they go back and they develop it again, and they release it. And then the security people come in and go like, what are you doing? Like, there's already 10 of these endpoints and there's this one over here and what's going on? So you go back, you do it again, right? And that sounds crazy, but that's exactly how most software is developed these days. And so if you do that design piece up front, you can parallelize those things and give your design to the infrastructure people, the security folks, and have a smoother transition as you go through release. So if you could just take those teams, running in parallel versus running, in like basically in triplicate, but really going through the process 3 different times. I mean, you should easily be able to put a cost savings to that for your teams and make the case to invest in developer experience.
Awesome. I think that's great advice. Well, thank you for joining us today. Is there, can people find you LinkedIn, Twitter, or where should they go to learn more about you or Stoplight?
Oh yeah, I'm all over the place, but I don't have like a standard name, so I would just direct them to stoplight.io, and we have all the socials on there that we can get you to.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the content, subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. If you're someone who is working on building and scaling SaaS product partnerships, we invite you to apply to be a member of our community at SaaSecosystemAlliance.com.